Hello, and welcome to the Geocurrents lecture series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections. Today's lecture will cover the period from 1880 to 1892. The main themes will be the rise of the Bourbon Democrats, and I'll explain what that means later on, versus the Republicans. This is a period when the two parties were relatively evenly matched in terms of electoral strength, although had very different geographical bases. And tariffs are the main difference, as ideological divisions are relatively muted in the period. I'll also talk about the division of the Republican Party into the so-called stalwarts, who were opposed to the so-called half-breeds. And then I'll talk about the rise of populism as a third force between the Democrats and Republicans, which is going to come into the fore in the next election with after this period is over, 1896. So in 1878, in the midterm House elections, both the Democrats and Republicans lose seats to the relatively new Greenback Party. I talked about that in the previous lecture. You can see on the left that the Democrats had a slight lead over Republicans, 141 seats to 132. But the Democrats in this House election lost 14 seats, and the Republicans lost 4, and the Greenbacks went from 0 to 13 seats. And you can see on the green on the map, the Greenback Party made gains in many different parts of the country, in several areas of the South, and the Midwest, and the Northeast, reflecting popular discontent with the economic policies of the time. The Greenbacks wanted paper currency. They wanted a moderate level of inflation to reduce debts. They also wanted a lot of reforms, regulation of monopolies, particularly railways, and generally what we would generally call a more progressive stance towards political issues. The presidential election of 1880 was a very close-cut affair. You can see the Republican candidate James Garfield, who won with 48.3% of the popular vote, as opposed to Winfield Hancock, the Democratic candidate's 48.2%, although the Electoral College was a bit less balanced, with Garfield winning, not decisively. You can also see the very clear geographical pattern. It's a bit different from the previous map. California has gone to the Democratic candidate Hancock, but Garfield won all the northern states except New Jersey, and Hancock won across the South and in the middle states as well. So very strict geographical divide. Both of them, interestingly, had been generals, Union generals in the Civil War. The Republicans had really been campaigning heavily on the Civil War. There was the phenomenon known as waving the bloody shirt, where in some cases they'd literally take a blood-stained shirt that they had worn in the war when they were wounded, and accuse their opponent, the Democratic opponent, of questioning their loyalty to the Union at the time. But since Hancock himself was a Civil War general on the Union side, that could hardly be done. Hancock wanted minimal tariffs for revenue, not to protect and support U.S. industries, and that was the main issue in the election. In a previous lecture, I did talk about Garfield. He previously had been the Republican House leader, extremely accomplished intellectually, highly educated, came from a very poor background. But was also noted as a reformer within the Republican Party. He wanted civil service reform, wanted to move away from patronage and so-called spoil system, and to choose people for federal appointments who were qualified by their own accomplishments rather than by party loyalty. It was to cost him his life, because shortly after he became president, he was shot and killed by a disgruntled office seeker, somebody who thought that his campaigning on behalf of Garfield had earned him an ambassadorship. He didn't get it, and he was mentally deranged as well. In the in the county map, there's some interesting things I want to note. I've talked about a lot of these patterns before. We still have some black voting in the South, so areas with overwhelmingly black majorities are still voting Republican. You can see some of those along the Mississippi River, coastal area of South Carolina, the Black Belt in Alabama. Other patterns I've talked a lot about before, like the Republican voting in eastern Tennessee and parts of eastern Kentucky. So a lot of that's familiar. One thing I want to mention here, though, is the German vote. So there's been very extensive German immigration to the United States in the 1840s, 50s, and even after the Civil War as well. There were certain areas that were settled heavily by Germans, but they had different voting patterns depending on whether they're more Protestant or Catholic and on whether they're located in the South or the North. So I have pointed out two areas in the South, and by South here I just mean former slave states. So one is Texas, the German hill country of Texas, which is noted as, you can see, as voting for Garfield on this map. And that's going to remain a real Republican stronghold in Texas. The state itself is going to be increasingly voting for the Democratic Party. But the German settlers in this region were very much opposed, had been opposed to slavery, had opposed to racial discrimination in general, and tended to support the Republican Party, which was the more racially progressive at this time. And that's also true of the Missouri Rhineland. I pointed out there in east central Missouri. I've talked about people like Carl Schurz, who liberal Republicans representing this region. It's quite different in the North, though. I've mentioned before how urban Catholics, Irish Catholics, especially in New York, were generally heavily affiliated with the Democratic Party. But some of the more rural counties in the the old Northwest, that's also true. And I point out Stearns County in Minnesota, main city there is St. Cloud. This region was very heavily settled by German Catholics. And they were opposed to the more pietistic Lutheran settlers, many of them from Norway, Sweden, some from Germany as well. But it was the Scandinavian Lutherans who tended to be heavily Republican voting and were inclined to things like support of prohibition of alcohol drinking, whereas the German Catholics and even German Lutherans to a large extent were much more inclined to oppose prohibitions. There was a sort of a cultural division here, and German Catholics in the North, there was sort of a tendency for voting for the Democratic Party in this period. And I do want to note that in the Texas German Hill Country, a dialect of German is still spoken. About 70,000 native speakers, mostly older. I was really surprised. This was way back in the 80s to be in Fredericksburg, Texas, in a cafe and hearing people all around me speaking in a German dialect. The German was spoken, not only spoken, but widely used in newspapers and other publications and education in many parts of the United States until World War I. We'll talk about this later in this series, where there was tremendous anti-German sentiments, and most of the German publishing houses were shut down. But there have been a few places, I suppose it's mostly with the Amish and other Anabaptist groups, where German dialects remain in use today. That's what's really alive, and young people are learning German dialects as their first language. And there are Amish settlements over much of the country. But this Texas Hill Country is kind of unique in that they're still, well, it's interesting, it has the date there, 1972. It's probably a lot less today. There's debates over how many people still speak this dialect. But as I mentioned before, there's a growing population imbalance between the North and South. It had been there for some time, but the North is experiencing much more migration, much more population gain. And so when you look at a cartogram where the counties are scaled by their population, you get a very different view. And as this map, as all of them show, New York City there, I haven't labeled it, but it's quite obvious in the eastern part of the country. Those very large counties, you can see voting for the Democratic candidate Hancock, although not overwhelmingly. It really varies from election to election. Or a map actually showing population density at the time. So there's the darker the areas are, the larger the population density, and you can see a lot of quite areas of quite sparse population, particularly in Florida. It took a long time for Florida to gain population, and you can see in the north there are areas like the Adirondacks, northern Maine, northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan with quite sparse population, but a real distinct band of heavier population from southern New England through New York and Pennsylvania, and then more discontinuously as you go to the west. And you don't see much of that in the south. I mean, you could pick out the Nashville and Memphis areas in Tennessee. You can pick out Atlanta in Georgia, but you don't see these more urban or semi-urban aggregations as you do elsewhere. And there's also growing wealth disparity. That had been true for some time. It was kind of masked by slavery. But with the end of slavery and looking at the entire population, you could see the South much poorer. So this is just showing distribution of wealth per capita. And the darker orange, the wealthier they are. It's interesting, the Missouri Rhineland area, eastern part of it with heavy German settlement, is quite marked here with higher wealth. Also, there's a lot of mining in the region. And California also shown as a zone, but the South really stands out here. So as I mentioned before, Garfield was assassinated in 1881. He was known as a half-breed Republican. That was an insult. It was used by their opponents who said, well, half-breeds are only half Republican. And they're half Republican because they did not support the Republican political machines. Both parties had political machines that had developed, especially in cities, but other areas as well. And these machines relied heavily on a spoils system where patronage jobs in the government were given out to prominent supporters. So the stalwart Republicans were all in favor of this. They said that's how it works. If we're going to win elections, you have to reward your supporters. They wanted a strong federal government. The half-breeds were very interested in protectionism and very pro-industry. The stalwarts were to some degree, but the half-breeds even more. They were, as opposed to the stalwarts, very much opposed to corruption. They even used the term anti-grantism because I spoke in the previous lecture how the administration of Ulysses Grant, particularly his vice president, Schuyler Colfax, were implicated in a lot of corruption issues. So they wanted civil service reform. Garfield certainly did, to give people jobs on the basis of merit rather than on support. And so we have an illustration here of Garfield being assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker. The leader of the stalwarts was Roscoe Conkling of New York State Senator, had many different offices. He basically had control of the patronage at the New York's Customs House. New York was by far the most important port, and so that was an office that resulted in a large amount of patronage and spoils to be distributed. And this quote from him, I think, is very telling. He's paraphrasing Samuel Johnson, famous writer of English dictionary in the 18th century. Johnson had said, "Patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel." Very famous quotation. But Conkling says when Dr. Johnson defined patriotism as the last refuge of a scoundrel, he ignored the enormous possibilities of the word reform. In other words, reform to him in his mind was a refuge for scoundrels, for people who were not loyal to the party, which was foremost in his mind. Garfield's vice president was a stalwart. They were seeking a balanced ticket, so Garfield himself being a reformer or half-breed. As president, his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, was on the other side of the Republican divide. But he was, at least as is usually depicted, was so chagrined and upset at the assassination of Garfield that he did pursue some civil service reform, and particularly supported what was known as the Pendleton Act that established a merit-based system for federal employees. It didn't end the controversy by any means, but it was a step in that direction. He also thwarted a lot of the half-breed designs for internal improvement, vetoed River and Harbor Act, for example, and supported the first major restriction on immigration, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. In the next election, Arthur is not particularly popular and is not nominated for the Republican Party for the following election in 1884. Instead, it goes to the acknowledged leader of the half-breed faction, James G. Blaine from Maine. And the Democratic nomination goes to Grover Cleveland, who is described as a Bourbon Democrat, and I will explain that in the next slide. But just to note here how close that election was. Popular vote, 48.8 for Cleveland, the Democrat, 48.3 for Blaine, the Republican. And the electoral vote is a little bit not quite as close. But had Blaine taken New York, which he almost did, he would have become president. But you can see on the map here, Cleveland did quite well in a lot of the, quite a few northeastern states, not only New York, but also taking Connecticut, New Jersey. Excuse me. These were considered those are the swing states of the time, along with Ohio and Indiana. Blaine took Ohio, but Indiana went for Cleveland, so a lot of inroads into the North. So what I need to do now is to explain who the Bourbon Democrats were. And I'll note that they are far, far away from the original vision of the Democratic Party established by Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, essentially 1820s and 1830s, when they created the modern Democratic Party out of the former Democratic Republican Party of Jefferson and Madison. But Jackson and Van Buren had been, to a certain extent, what we might call populist. At least they had populist inclinations. They were certainly very much in favor of democratization, limited to white men, but were opposed to property qualifications and tax-paying qualifications that had previously been in play, and wanted more voting and more democratic participation. And I wouldn't say that Grover Cleveland was against that, but he certainly favored the wealthy, at least as it would be usually portrayed. So what do they mean by Bourbon Democrats? So Bourbon, the word comes from, has two connotations here. One is the whiskey, hard liquor. This was a time when the Republicans tended more in the direction of sort of nascent prohibitionism is gaining. It isn't overwhelmingly strong, but it's sort of it's gaining leeway in the Republican Party, and certainly an opposition to intense consumption of alcohol. And it's also reflects the old Bourbon dynasty of France and of Spain as well in the 18th century, sort of viewed as somewhat decadent and elite by many. But the Bourbon Democrats wanted very limited federal government and were in favor of states' rights, as had been the basic policy of the Democratic Party since its foundation, and is going to continue to be so until the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. That was one of the things that separated the Democrats from the Whigs in the pre-Civil War period and separates the Democrats from the Republicans in the post-Civil War period. Democrats more states' rights, the Republicans more federal power, although both of them wanted limited federal power by today's standards. Bourbon Democrats wanted laissez-faire economics, government out of economics. What a contrast with the later Democratic Party, created essentially under the auspices of Franklin Roosevelt during the Depression. But the view of the Bourbon Democrats was if the government gets involved in the economy, it's going to be doing so to help business. If we want a fairer system, government should simply stay out. Bourbon Democrats were very much in favor of hard money and the gold standard. So they wanted what they saw as the financial stability that would come from that. They had a lot of support from Wall Street, not a monopoly of support by any means, but quite a bit, because there was a general view in financial circles for hard money. Whereas many poor people, particularly indebted farmers in the West, wanted softer money, which would allow a moderate degree of inflation, which will help them with their debt problems. Bourbon Democrats were very much opposed to populism and progressivism. Progressivism really comes in a little bit later, and I'll talk about that. There's a lot of overlap between populism and progressivism. They shared a lot of ideas of reform. Populism is more bottom up, and progressivism more top down. So that will be discussed at some length. They're also in favor of a relatively secular attitude and moderation on social issues. The Republican Party tended to be more associated with Protestant Christianity. The Democrats in the North with Catholicism, but the Bourbon Democrats certainly were not interested in things like moving towards alcohol prohibition, as one example. This political cartoon is really shows, I think, in quite detailed fashion what the issues were and how they were conceived at the time. So it's from the satirical political magazine Puck. I have a lot of illustrations from it. It is from this election, 1884. And the Democratic Party is represented by a woman who's been cast ashore on a rocky coast and is in desperate situation. Underneath her, you can see an overturned jug of liquor labeled Bourbonism, so alcohol figuring prominently. You could see an indigenous-looking person menacing with a bow labeled Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was the Irish-dominated Democratic political machine that was extremely important in New York City throughout this period. So the Democratic Party is seen as under threat from its own somewhat corrupt political urban machines, particularly that of New York City. There's a barrel labeled "Life Sustained for 8 Years" by the fraud issue. The fraud issue would have been the 1876 election of Rutherford B. Hayes, discussed in the previous lecture, where Samuel Tilden, the Democratic candidate, won a clear majority of the popular vote and perhaps even the electoral vote, but a deal was struck where Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, won the Electoral College by 1 vote, and in return eased off on Reconstruction of the South and basically let white supremacy begin to gradually take hold there. And what else do we see? Then we see a ship, and the cartoon is labeled "A Sail, a Sail," so it's salvation that the Democratic Party sees. And that salvation are independent Republicans known as mugwumps, who are at this time are going to be abandoning the Republican Party because of alleged, and actual corruption within it. So again, corruption figuring really prominently on both parties. Were the Bourbon Democrats the faction of fun? And I put that in somewhat satirically. My own academic career has been for many years based at Stanford University. I'm now emeritus retired from Stanford. But there, over the last 5 years, has been a huge issue at Stanford called what the students call the War on Fun. They have charged the administration of the university of undertaking a war on fun, basically by restricting the consumption of alcohol, making it very much more difficult for students to drink. There are many, many other issues involved with this, but sort of allegations that the administration has been trying to govern how students socialize and restrict their ability to have fun. So I found it very interesting that I was able to find an interview and with this illustration. Grover Cleveland, the funniest president ever. And just a quote from this, the guest gives a tour of both sides of Cleveland, the hardworking politician and lawyer, and the fun-loving guy who enjoyed drinking, hunting, and fishing. Was Grover a cut-up in private? Did his upright reputation prevent him from joking in public? And what exactly is rotund jocularity? Well, rotund Cleveland was somewhat large in size. But anyway, this election where Cleveland wins was another real mudslinging election. And in these days, it wasn't the presidential candidates themselves who did the mudslinging, but their supporters and surrogates. And the Republicans capitalized on the fact that Grover Cleveland, who was a bachelor during this time when he's running for president, he's later to marry, but he was a bachelor, and he was credibly accused of having fathered a child out of wedlock. He actually owed up to it, paid child support, and that was quite scandalous at the time. So Republicans would harass the Democrats by chanting, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" And you could see this in the illustration here from The Judge, which was a very Republican-oriented magazine at the time, with the baby crying, "I want my pa," and there's Cleveland sort of stomping up and down. I would note that Democrats would later counter with, "Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha," as he won the election. Now, James Blaine of Maine, the Republican candidate, occupied a somewhat difficult position where he was the leader of the stalwarts, the reform faction of the Republicans, who wanted political cleanup, wanted to eliminate the spoil system. But on the other hand, he was accused, with a certain amount of evidence and never fully substantiated, but he was accused of being involved in a number of corrupt schemes of payments and kickbacks connected with financial institutions, monopolistic trusts, and the like. Blaine himself was, almost everyone agreed, brilliant and charismatic, but he had these corruption allegations hanging on him. And we can see this very clearly in another illustration of the time, another political cartoon, again from Puck. And it is called Friend Before the Chicago Tribunal. Before going in analyzing this, I will note that the Democrats had their own chant, which was Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, Continental Liar from the state of Maine. So accused of hypocrisy, of being a reformer who himself is involved in all sorts of corruption. And what the cartoon shows is, well, it's not labeled Blaine, but the figure in the left center is Blaine. He has been disrobed, not entirely naked, but his cloak taken off, and tattooed on his body are all the scandals that he is alleged to have been involved with. And then we see, dressed in ancient Greek garb, modern leaders of the Republican Party, including Theodore Roosevelt. He's in there, and people are just shocked by this unveiling. Now, you might wonder why they would do it this way. Why would Blaine be portrayed as, and the others as ancient Greeks? And why the name Phryne? Or what would that mean? Now, to modern readers, it means nothing. I've asked many people that I know, and nobody has any idea who Phryne was. Well, people at the time, voters, educated voters, would have known, because the norm at the time for education was a large degree of classical education, immersion in the worlds of ancient Rome and Greece. And Phryne was the most famous courtesan of ancient Athens. This was a time in ancient Athens, a woman really could only have power in her own right, or influence in two ways. She could be a priestess at a temple. The Pythia, the prophet at the Temple of Delphi. I mean, that was an important position. That was a female position. But respectable married women were basically cloistered in the house. They were not entirely, but they didn't have a public role. But a courtesan, on the other hand, could become wealthy, influential, and even intellectually engaged. Be invited to symposia, for example, drinking parties where philosophical issues were often discussed. So Phryne was the most famous, noted for her beauty. The wealthiest men of Athens vied for her affection. She was able to endow temples from her own money. So, a very important person. And she was charged by her enemies with impiety and was taken to a tribunal. And just a couple decades earlier, a French artist had depicted that. And look at this illustration, and then we look at Phryne before the Areopagus, and we could see where that illustration comes from. And the story is that the jurors were so taken by her beauty that they voted to acquit her of the charge. It's probably uncertain whether that's true, but it is interesting to look at her way she's covering her face, the way he's covering his face. It's pretty much a send up of this at one time famous painting. So with all these allegations against Blaine, the faction known as the Mugwumps of the Republicans jump ship. So these are sort of the most liberal, maybe we could say, the most reformist faction of the Republican Party, particularly in the Northeast. So again, the illustration here, we see Blaine and the great American gain of public office for private gain. And just some prominent mugwumps. Mark Twain was certainly one of them. Carl Schurz, the German-born politician from Missouri. Henry Ward Beecher, brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Charles Francis Adams, grandson of John Adams, son of John Quincy Adams, and his son, Henry Adams, both extraordinarily important scholars. Case of Charles Francis Adams, diplomat. James Russell Lowe, one of the most famous poets. Thomas Nast, famous political cartoonist. Young Theodore Roosevelt did not join the Mugwump group. He remained loyal to Blaine, but he did note that most of his friends in the upper class of New York, Republicans, to a person probably, generally supported the Mugwump group and voted for Grover Cleveland. And I note the term Grover the Good. That was certainly what the Democrats called him because of his reputation for financial integrity and standing up to corruption. But it was a very close election, regardless of this defection. And Blaine may have been defeated because of one comment by one supporter. And this was the 29th of October, right before the election. It's in New York City, Presbyterian minister in a predominantly Catholic city, controlled by the powerful Tammany Hall political machine. But Burchard said in a speech supporting Blaine, "We are Republicans and don't propose to leave our party, like the Mugwumps. We're not going to leave our party and identify ourselves with a party whose antecedents are rum, Romanism, and rebellion." So nice alliteration. Basically, he means by that alcohol, particularly hard alcohol, Roman Catholicism, and the Civil War. This did not go over well in the Irish community in New York, and Blaine lost New York State and hence the election by only a little over 1,000 votes. Cleveland did take New York and all of southern New York City and surrounding areas, but by a somewhat narrower margin than usual, and that cost them the election. So looking into the first Cleveland administration, Grover Cleveland is going to lose the next election in the Electoral College, although he's going to win the popular vote, and then he's going to win the election after that, 1892. Only president who won, lost one, and had non-sequential terms, although that may happen in 2024. But Cleveland did push forward a lot of civil service reform. He also signed the Interstate Commerce Act that established the Interstate Commerce Commission, first railroad regulation, so again, reforming. But he very much supported the gold standard and was opposed to the free silver movement. That was a movement to allow anyone with silver to take it to a mint and allow it to be coined, which would result in sort of end deflation, result in some moderate inflation, and help debtors. He vetoed many spending measures, including pension benefits for Union veterans. You can see here in the political cartoon where he's vetoing a silver bill with a rock around it and going to settle it. Push forward some tariff reduction, tariff being the biggest issue of the time. But he was also had a lot of problems. One was growing labor unrest. So this is an area of rapid and rampant industrialization, heavy industry, a lot more people working in heavy industry. Pretty, well, by today's standards, extremely harsh conditions, relatively low pay, and really for the first time starting to get labor radicalism. And neither party was supporting labor at this time. It's quite a bit later that the Democratic Party becomes the party of laborers, of labor unions and the like. That wasn't true at this time. But in Chicago, there was a well-known so-called Haymarket Affair, a riot at a demonstration. Demonstrators were demanding an 8-hour day. A bomb was thrown at the police. The police retaliate. 15 people are dead, over 70 industries. And Cleveland doesn't really do much in response. That cost them support from both labor and business. Labor wanted support, and business wanted anti-labor policies. But his policy was laissez-faire, government hands off. So in the next election, 1888, partly because of that issue, he loses the election and the Electoral College, but still wins the popular vote. Even by a slightly larger margin. But you can see on the map, he had retained some of the so-called doubtful states of the North, like Connecticut and New Jersey, but loses New York. And again, New York is crucial. And just like the previous election, it was one issue that probably cost him the New York vote. The previous one, it was the Rum, Romanism, and Rebellion line that cost the Republican James Blaine from taking New York. In this case, 4 years later, was the Murchison letter, a classic October surprise. So this was a letter sent by a Republican operative, but he was posing as a British immigrant. And he wrote a letter to the British ambassador saying, "Who should I vote for?" And the British ambassador said, "I'll vote for Grover Cleveland because Cleveland is in favor of reduced tariff or free trade. Britain by this time is very much in favor of free trade. It has the largest and most competitive heavy industry in the world, and it wants foreign markets, and so it's supporting free trade very heavily." And this letter infuriated Irish Americans who were quite anti-British because of British colonialism in Ireland and a number of other reasons. So you can see in this political cartoon in the bottom, Cleveland cringing before his master John Bull being the personification of the United Kingdom, and Cleveland is sort of groveling at his feet. And then you can see above England's candidate, Irishmen beware, Cleveland is the friend of England. So international politics, again, implicated in American politics, and a very close election where this one incident probably cost Cleveland the election. If we go back, we see here Cleveland's opponent in this was a Republican, Benjamin Harrison, grandson of Whig President William Henry Harrison, sometimes described as a human iceberg. He wasn't charismatic, let's put it that way. He was not a fun president. His campaign was really focused on the tariff issue. So you can see here a map that was put out as a campaign propaganda, if you will, and all over it you can see protection. So protection up in the Northwest for American beef, pork, and mutton. Also anti-Asian immigration, no more coolie or contract labor. That would be opposition to Asian immigration. And it's interesting, an anti-Mormon jab here with death to polygamy in Utah, which is not yet a state. It is not going to become a state until the Mormons turn against polygamy, and then it's eventually going to become one of the most Republican voting states, but not at this time. But all over the map, you can see protection, protective duties, and focusing on the different products of different states, that the Republicans will keep up a high tariff and keep that out. As I mentioned in an earlier slide, there's growing discontent with both parties because neither of them are really addressing the economic needs of laborers in growing industries or of farmers in many areas, and particularly the problem of indebted farmers, and particularly indebted farmers in the far west and the Great Plains, where there had been some extreme droughts and a lot of economic distress. And so this shows the other vote here. So there's several different parties, and it only goes up to 6%. But you could see in parts of the North, but also especially in the sort of the Great Plains states like Kansas and Nebraska, we can see a very heavy vote, basically for the new populist movement, which has a lot of the same ideas that the Greenback Party had, but extending them a little further. Under Benjamin Harrison, the Republicans are able to push through a very tough tariff act. It's called the McKinley Act. McKinley was a member of the House. He's going to become president in 1896, but he was in Congress at this time, and he was he was dubbed the Napoleon of protection, of high tariff. I found on an auction website this ceramic vase of McKinley depicted as Napoleon. I have to say, it doesn't look all that much like McKinley to me, so I have to trust the auction site that that's who it is. It indeed is. But under Benjamin Harrison, with William McKinley as in Congress, tariffs are increased by up to 50%. That's a big increase. There was a problematic reciprocity clause where the U.S. said, well, we'll reduce tariffs on other countries if they do reduce our tariffs on our exports, but it didn't work out very well. And this tariff increase did lead to significant price increases. The U.S. was still importing a lot, and that was caused a lot of anger and distress, and especially in certain areas of the country. Under Harrison, there were a couple of important acts. One was the path-breaking Sherman Antitrust Act, as a real reforming bill. So we're starting to get economic monopolies, particularly in the railways, but in other economic sectors as well. So here we have Uncle Sam shining a lantern on trusts depicted as royalty and sitting on cash boxes and ledger books and the like. It wasn't really going to be enforced to a huge degree until later, though. So it's a pioneering bill, but it becomes much more important when you have progressive presidents, progressive Republican like Theodore Roosevelt or a progressive Democrat like Woodrow Wilson. They're going to be much more actively engaged in trust busting. But it starts at this time. John Sherman, who is the congressman whose name is attached to this bill, is more famously associated with another bill, the Silver Purchase Act. And this was to try to address the issues in the western states with silver mines and Great Plains states with all these indebted farmers to try to ease up on the monetary supply. And not going to abandon the sort of semi-gold standard that the U.S. ran on, but they're going to modify it with the Silver Purchase Act. And the basic idea of this act was that the U.S. Treasury had to purchase a large amount of silver every month, and then Treasury notes would be issued, so paper money that could be redeemable in silver or in gold to give that paper money a firm foundation in precious metals. But gold was seen as much more stable than silver, so this actually led to a decrease in the price of silver, an increase in the price of gold, and it led to a credit crunch and some bank failures. It was not very successful. Let's just put it that way. And I would note that John Sherman is the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, famous Civil War general, famous for his success and his brutality in the South. Another reforming bill of this time failed, but it's worth mentioning anyway, and that's the Lodge Bill of 1890. And this was designed to protect black voting rights, at least in federal elections, not in state elections. This was really the last push of the Republicans for comprehensive, far-reaching civil rights legislation. So it was something that the Republican Party had been based on in its early years, but had moved away from. And at this time, black voters were being pretty much disenfranchised across the South. It's not complete, but it's an ongoing process, and it's been very successful in returning the South to the Democratic Party by preventing black people from voting. And that passed in the House narrowly, but was successfully filibustered in the Senate. And sort of tragically, Republicans in the West agreed not to support the Lodge bill in exchange for Southerners supporting the Silver Purchase Act, because silver mining was the economic key to, well, especially Nevada, but also Colorado, Idaho, Montana to a certain extent. So these western mining states, there was a tremendous desire for moving away from gold towards silver. Republicans in the Northeast, they wanted Southern support for that McKinley Tariff Act, so they traded away their votes. And the political cartoon from Judge, Republican paper, is very telling. So we have Uncle Sam looking at a Democratic donkey, and the donkey is warning with a very scary scarecrow like placard saying, Negro supremacy, the Republican Party will subject the South to the horror and humiliation of black rule, essentially. But then behind the Democratic donkey, you see John Bull, the personification of the United Kingdom, with the tariff question and pauper labor money bag, and the tag being Uncle Sam. You cannot distract my attention from the real issue. Who is that hiding behind you? So the idea that it's the British who are pushing all of this for their free trade ideology and to try to undermine American protectionism. And it is important to mention the significance of Henry Cabot Lodge, Sr. His son was later to become an important politician as well. But he's a quintessential Boston Brahmin, one of the members of these fairly small families that were politically and influentially dominant in New England. Intellectually played a sort of an outsized role. He was one of the very first history PhDs in the U.S. And wrote a number of works on it. Legal scholar, historical scholar, close friend of Theodore Roosevelt. Later on, we'll come back to Henry Cabot Lodge because he led the congressional opposition in 1919 to the Treaty of Versailles to end World War I, and especially to the League of Nations, which was masterminded by Woodrow Wilson and other Democrats, but which died in Congress and was not ratified in the United States, did not join, predecessor of the United Nations. So anyways, there were a lot of problems that the Republicans faced in the next presidential election of 1890. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act had not worked. It led to a lot of economic uncertainty, credit crunch, bank runs, like I said. And in the midterm election of 1890, the Republicans were just obliterated in the House. I mean, it's just extraordinary. If you look at that text I've highlighted, the previous election, the Democrats had 152 seats and the Republicans had 179. Republicans lost 93, the Democrats gained 86, the Populists gained 8, but after the election, the Democrats had 238 seats to the Republicans' 86, so it's just one of the biggest House landslide elections ever. And you could see on the map Democrats making gains in places where they just hadn't had much political support at all. Places like much of Michigan, northern Illinois, Wisconsin, areas of western Massachusetts. These areas had been Republican strongholds, had been Whig strongholds before that. So this was one of the most devastating midterm elections. And in the next election, no surprise, we see reprise of the previous election. Grover Cleveland coming back, trying to get a second term, opposed to the incumbent Benjamin Harrison. This election is closer. You could see Cleveland wins the popular vote by about 3 percentage points, the Electoral College by a much larger margin. The populists, though, who are in favor of workers' rights and especially farmer, opposed to the industrial trusts, opposed to railway monopolies, wanting another wave of democratization, essentially, do quite well and take a number of states. They take 2 agricultural states. North Dakota split. You could see 1, 1, and 1. States, it's up to the states how to determine their electoral votes, but the popular state, Kansas, and then 3 mining states, Colorado, Idaho, and Nevada. It's the first time that Wisconsin and Illinois go for the Democratic Party since the Civil War. That was a major swing. And I will just quickly point out the election in Wisconsin. So Wisconsin has had a lot of immigration of Germans and Scandinavians. The eastern part of Wisconsin tended to be more heavily settled by German Catholics. I mean, there's plenty of non-Germans. I don't want to emphasize this too much. There are settlers from many parts of northern parts of the United States, but the eastern part of Wisconsin had larger degree of Norwegian, some Swedish, more Lutheran in its background. And that was reflected in a lot of votes, where you could see here the western part much more in favor of the Bourbon Democrat Cleveland, and the west much more in favor of Benjamin Harrison, the Republican. So the Norwegian Lutherans tended to be more sort of pietistic, as it's usually termed. We could say more evangelical or devout, so much more opposed to things like alcohol consumption. And this is a pattern that's going to be true for many decades. I will note that the county that voted most heavily for Harrison, Adams County in the center of the state, was settled by so-called Yankees from New England and Western New York, which had been the most Whig and then later Republican voting part of the country. So when you see these sort of different county level patterns, it often has to do with settlement patterns. I put in Wisconsin partly because it is going to become by far the most progressive state in later decades. We'll see this very clearly in the 1924 election when the Progressive Party, contesting both the Democrats and Republicans, which had, again, both had become quite conservative by that time. There was a strong progressive movement in the early 20th century where both the Democrats and Republicans had strong progressive wings, but in the 1920s, that really diminished, and Wisconsin became the center of sort of the new progressive movement. And the populist platform, the populists did quite well. I mean, you could see they didn't take any states, but they did have significant popular support. It's interesting to look at their platform of this year, 1892. Free coinage of silver. Yeah, that means anyone with silver, an individual or a mine or whatever, can take that silver to a mint and get it turned into currency. The idea was to result in a moderate level of inflation to reduce debts. But they wanted secret ballot, which is coming into play at this time, and a progressive income tax that comes in quite a bit later. Nationalization of railways, telegraphs, and telephones. So, this is the time when the Democratic Party under Cleveland was very much laissez-faire. A little bit of regulation of, they'd have the Interstate Commerce Commission, but generally they don't want the federal government too involved. And the Republicans are still quite wary of doing that. That will change later on. They also wanted the initiative, referendum, and recall, which is something that the progressive movement is really going to latch onto, and it's going to become enacted by a number of states. They want a shorter work day, 8 hours. They want support for labor unions, and they're also opposed to large-scale immigration, which they see as undermining labor power, that they want a tight labor market to increase wages. And the illustration shows the actual protectors of our industries, where we see the workers bowed down, weighed down by this ship, which is carrying huge amounts of bags of money, sat on by plutocrats. So they're saying the protection is what we don't need is protection against foreign imports. What we need is protection of laborers. The populace, though, they didn't do very well. They did very poorly in industrial cities and in farming areas in the eastern half of the country. They appealed to workers, but they didn't get their vote. It's going to be quite some time before that changes. So working class people were still were not convinced by the populist message that it was going to help them. Where they did get a lot of vote was in the silver mining districts and then the agriculturally distressed regions of the Great Plains, from Kansas through Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota, where there had been some very severe droughts and deeply indebted farmers and a lot of real misery at the time. I won't spend much time on the cartogram, but you can see the green area is not quite as large as on the other. And I'll also note some areas of the South, and Alabama especially, parts of Georgia, even North Carolina. It's not so clear on the map, but populists were doing quite well in Texas too. And that's going to be important in later elections. So Cleveland is elected again for his second term, not after having been interrupted by Harrison. But he loses his popularity very quickly. And as so often happens, it comes from an economic panic, or really we could say depression. So 1893 was one of the biggest, probably the biggest one before the Great Depression of 1929. As is usual, it came from overextension of railroads and speculative investments. A lot of the railway lines were not profitable. Huge amounts of money had been poured into them. Falling crop prices with a lot of farm foreclosures. That speaks to the debt crisis. The Silver Purchase Act of 1890 is going to be repealed, but it resulted in the devaluation of silver, losing much of its value. Many people say there's kind of a global gold famine. There wasn't enough gold at the time. Later that's going to change when new gold deposits are discovered. But gold is in somewhat short supply. And Cleveland, as a Bourbon Democrat, was strictly interested in the gold standard. And so there's more deflation, hurting those in debt, and mounting labor unrest. So it's spreading into other areas. Particularly in 1893 was the Pullman labor strike. So the Pullman company, they had their own company town, building these sleeper cars for the railways. And you can see here in the illustration, we have Pullman depicted as having employees or laborers in a screw press and bearing down on them with low wages on the top and high rent, because they had a company town and workers had to pay rent for their housing there. But this was a bloody strike. It required federal intervention, use of military force, injunction against the strike. Socialist leader Eugene Debs was arrested. He would be several times. And the government basically is protecting the railroads. Cleveland was in a very difficult situation, and this was a huge challenge. He didn't really deal well with it. So, just like the Republicans had just been obliterated in the midterm election of 1890, in the midterm election of 1894, it's the Democrats' term. And so look at another just incredible swing where the Republicans, you see the seats before, I didn't highlight that, but before the election, the Democrats had 198 and the Republicans had 143. But the Republicans win 253, and her Democrats only 93. That is a swing of up 100 for the Republicans, up down 110 for the Republicans, down 105. So just an overwhelming disaster for the Democrats in that midterm election. 4 years after the Republicans had had a disaster in a previous midterm election. So what did that tell you? That the country is really in flux and in a bit of a crisis, political crisis at this time. I do note on the map that the state of Nevada, it's not Republicans, it's not Democrats, not popular. They have their own party, the Silver Party, because silver was the lifeblood of Nevada, which was a state just barely hanging on. Look at its population. In 1880, it only had 62,000 people, a relatively new state. Huge silver mines, but then that plummets by 1900 down to 42,000. Really hardly enough to maintain a state. There was a mint in Carson City that was shut down. I mean, it was just devastating. Anyway, this leads us finally up to my last slide, which is going to be the realigning election of 1896, and that will be the focus of the next lecture, or one of the foci of that, where the Democrats have a total turn, abandoning the Bourbon Democrats faction of Grover Cleveland and nominating someone of a populist faction. And the Populist Party actually merges to a large degree with the Democratic Party. And that populist is William J. Bryan of Nebraska, noted as the Boy Orator of the Platte. And he is going to run against William McKinley. Remember, McKinley was the author of the McKinley Tariff, the largest tariff that increase that the U.S. had seen for many, many decades. So really pitting two very different approaches to politics. A much bigger divide between the two parties than had been in effect in previous decades when the main issue was tariffs. But now, with the Democrats turning to the populist side, the division becomes quite stark. And we'll see. It's William McKinley who wins that election quite decisively, but that creates what is sometimes called then the fourth party system. And this is a system where the Republicans generally dominate, except during a period of World War I, 1812, 1816. 1812, the Republicans divide again into two factions, and Theodore Roosevelt leaves the Republican Party and forms a new Progressive Party or Bull Moose Party, and that allows the Democrat Woodrow Wilson to be elected, and he's reelected in 1916. But then the Republicans come back into dominance in the 1920s. And so that fourth party period is usually held as lasting from 1896 to 1932. So I'll talk about the earlier part of that period in the next lecture. Thank you for listening, and I hope you can tune into subsequent lectures.